Okay, so we're going to let all the stress and strife of the world stay outside these doors, and we're just going to focus today on learning some more about our nervous system and how it works, because it's pretty cool and amazing. Before we get into that, just want to give you a little update on COVID, because it's been a while since I have. And a large part of the reason why it's been a while is that Stout students have been doing a really good job at keeping this under control. So Stout student numbers went really high really fast at the beginning of the semester and gave me a lot of palpitations, and then came back down and have stayed relatively low ever since then. So we maybe diagnose about a dozen cases per week, which is way better than where we were several weeks ago. Unfortunately, right, so this was that bump that we saw in the Stout students. So what we're looking at right here with the green line is active cases, so people who are currently infectious. They have a confirmed COVID infection and they're during their infectious period, so capable of transmitting it to other people. So we had that big bump in September, which came down, but what we're seeing now is we're seeing widespread transmission in the community. So it's not the college students now who are passing it around to each other for the most part. That's still happening, but at lower rates. What we're seeing is a lot of transmission in the community itself, and we're at our highest level ever with about 325 current active cases as of Monday night at 9 p.m., which is when the state updates the databases. And it's gotten to the point now where in Dunn County, our health department is so overwhelmed they can barely call all the people who have a positive test, let alone then try to call those people's close contacts and get them into quarantine and manage to get them tested. So it's a huge blow to our ability from a public health standpoint to try to control transmission. Because of Halloween. I think it's because of Halloween. This started before Halloween, so let me show you the next. So this is week by week and broken down by age decades, okay? So this light green color here, this is age 20 to 29. This is how the state chunks it up. The blue below is age 10 to 19. So in September, right, it was mostly young people. And then, but quite soon after, we started to see increasing numbers in older people, right? And so that started way before Halloween. And what we're seeing this week, because this is data just through Sunday night at 9 p.m., but what we're seeing this week is likely the ramifications of Halloween, and also possibly some of the in-person voting at many of the polling stations. Not all of the clerks and poll workers were wearing masks, and many of the voters were not wearing masks. So this is not a good time in Menominee to not wear a mask, because there's a lot of COVID around there. And a lot of the people who've been exposed don't know they've been exposed because the health department is not able to call them all. So this is happening in our state overall. I think we may be the only state that hasn't put any restrictions on bars. Right, we're breaking records regularly with number of new cases diagnosed per day. So this line is the moving 7-day average of new cases per day. So we almost hit 6,000 cases day before yesterday. So this is going up quite rapidly, and it's got many people appropriately worried. Because, right, most people who get COVID won't need to go to the hospital. That's very, very true. But when we have thousands and thousands and thousands of people who get sick with it, that means we have hundreds and hundreds of people that do end up in the hospital. So these are our hospitalization rates for the different regions. We're this green one here, right? We don't have nearly as many people as southeastern Wisconsin, right, Milwaukee area. But we're seeing a significant increase such that our local hospitals are now postponing all elective surgeries and appointments because they just don't have room in the hospital to take care of somebody like after a hip replacement or a knee replacement or an ACL repair or something like that. This is also our total hospital beds available. 88% of them are full right now statewide. I've never seen that so high ever since the pandemic began. For most of the time, it was down around 40 to 60% full. So this is really concerning. Our deaths, as you would expect, are also going up, right? So we're also setting new records for numbers of deaths by day. And this is also happening nationally. So as a country, we just hit 100,000 cases in a day for the first time ever this week. So we're seeing, you know, and this is just a matter of the fact that this disease is everywhere now, right? In March, there wasn't a lot of COVID in Wisconsin, right? You could run around and kiss everybody you saw. And the likelihood of you getting COVID would still be really low. It just wasn't here. But now it's pretty much everywhere, so it's much easier to catch it. So we're seeing many more cases. We also do have more tests, and we're doing more testing, right? So some of the increase in the numbers that we're seeing is due to the fact that we're able to test for it and find it more, right? However, that is not the only explanation, right? There actually is more COVID, and we know that because our deaths are going up, our hospitalizations are going up. This is national deaths per day in the United States. And so we had a lot in the beginning. This is when New York City added a whole bunch of deaths that they were like, oh gosh, that was probably COVID that had happened over the previous couple of weeks back before they had tests. They went back and like did tests on the corpses, right? Things got under control. Then we had kind of a summer increase. So many southern states, you might remember Texas had a real problem over the summer, as well as some other southern states. So deaths climbed in the summer and came back down. And it looks as though they're starting to trend upward again. And so the thing about it is you don't die from COVID the day you get diagnosed, right? If you die from COVID, it tends to be 1 to 3 weeks later, right? Because you get really sick, and you're really sick for a while, and then a lot of people ultimately don't make it. So if you kind of look at, you know, these are deaths, these are the cases, right? So you see we had this bump in cases in the summer, followed a couple of weeks later by a bump in deaths. So what we're worried about, right, is that a couple of weeks from now, this bump in cases is also going to cause a bump in deaths nationally. So that's the concern. So it's everywhere right now. It's in all age groups, right? It's not just the young people. And our health department is currently overwhelmed, right? So right now, we're recommending that you shouldn't be within 6 feet or unmasked around anybody that you don't live with. If you've already had COVID, there's a silver lining, right? You're kind of immune for 90 days, so you're lucky, in a way, right? It doesn't mean you should try to get COVID. Right. One of my friends who's a professor here is now on day 10, really sick. Not in the hospital, but really sick. She's 10 years younger than I am. She's pretty young. All right. So, oh, that's exciting. Okay. So now we're going to, any questions about COVID before we resume nervous system? Yeah, Dana. Isn't it going up in other countries as well? Yes, really good point. So we're also seeing increases in COVID in other countries in the world, particularly European countries. And so the UK is closing its pubs, and Italy now has a curfew, and Spain and France. We have a friend who lives in France, and they've just been put under a complete lockdown for 1 month. They can't even leave their house for a month. Right? Really strong, aggressive response on the part of the French government. And we can debate whether that's appropriate or not, right? But what's interesting is we're seeing these increasing cases in countries where two things are true. One, it's getting colder, so people are congregating indoors more often. And two, in countries that tend to have overall place a higher value on personal freedom and liberty than they do on communal benefit, right? So a lot of the Far East countries, right? So Japan, South Korea, China, where communal benefit is placed very high value, they're fine. Trade-offs, right? Good. Other questions? Oh, vaccine update. Well, so the two leading in terms of far enough along in the process, like the two, like so the Moderna and the other one, can't remember the name, Oxford, no, can't remember, that use mRNA for their vaccine delivery or mechanism are in phase 3 trials still. So we don't have enough data yet to know whether or not they're working. One of the tricky things with both of those vaccines is that their storage requirements are really tough. So one of them needs to be stored at -20 centigrade and the other one -70 centigrade. Those are freezers that most clinics and public health departments do not have. Right? So the logistics for those vaccines, if they turn out to be effective, is going to be a major hurdle. There are 2 other vaccines that use different viruses to end up giving you, basically making your cells produce the antigen that will make your immune system produce the antibody against that spike protein that would protect you. And they're on pause investigating some adverse reactions. But they would only have to be stored in a typical fridge, like we have our other vaccines in. So from a logistics standpoint, those would be much easier to roll out. So still waiting on a vaccine, yeah.
So I remember you were talking about how it's like really prone to getting on those ACE2 receptors.
Yeah.
And I think you said the reason why we don't have something that like sort of disables them is because it has to do with blood pressure.
Yes.
Okay, so.
Right. So the way the virus gets into our cells is it has this spike protein, this antigen on its surface that docks on a receptor on our cells called the ACE2 receptor, and that's how it then gets into the cell. If the virus can't get in your cell, it dies. I mean, it was never really alive to begin with, but it can't do anything to you. It's harmless. Right? But we can't block those receptors because those receptors have a purpose, and they're really important for regulation of blood pressure. Right. Other questions about COVID? All right, let's get nervous. Okay, nervous system. Let's just review a couple things from last time so we're in the right headspace, right? Remember, nervous system is all about information, right? We're going to send information out, we're going to receive information in, and we're going to process and integrate it. It's all about information, signals. We have 2 major divisions, the CNS, or the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord. And that's where almost all your neuron cell bodies live. And then we have the PNS, the peripheral nervous system, which is mostly just nerves. And you'll remember that nerves are just bundles of axons. Right? When we talk about nervous tissue, we have the neurons, the stars of the show, that are actually sending those signals. And then the neuroglia, which are the support cells. And remember, the neuron has little branch-like projections off of its cell body called dendrites, which receive signals from other neurons. The cell body, where the nucleus and most of the organelles are housed, and then the long axon, which is basically the wire that's then going to go out to wherever it's sending the signal. And that axon is covered by a fatty material called the myelin sheath. And it's that myelin sheath that speeds up conduction and also makes nerves look kind of white. This kind of white fatty stuff. At the very end of the axon, we have those axon terminals, like the little frog feet, right? And then we're going to have the synapse. All right, so when we're going to send a signal, first the neuron has to decide it's going to do that. That's called, that's right, we have to have the resting potential. So we have to have the precondition. We have to have our dominoes all lined up. We have to have sodium pumped outside of the axon so that the outside of the axon is relatively positive and the inside of the axon is relatively negative. That separation of charges, like a battery, gives us potential energy. So that's the resting potential. Then the neuron decides it's going to send a signal, and it's going to open sodium gates, right, in the axon, starting closest to the cell body. Once those gates open, sodium is like, finally, and it's going to rush into the inside of the axon. Right? And as it does so, that's a movement of charged particles. That's an electrical current. That will then cause the gates next to it to open, which causes the gates next to it to open, and all the way down the length of the axon, we get this perpetuation of an electrical signal. When it reaches the end, right, it gets the axon terminal, which is then going to release neurotransmitters, little chemical messengers, out into that space between the axon terminal and the receiving cell. Okay? So there's that problem of that physical space. We can't send an electrical current across empty space. So we send out the neurotransmitter. The neurotransmitter then has to dock on specific receptors. You can't see it without a receptor for it. And then that will transmit the signal to the receiving cell. When we need to end that signal, right? So we don't want, once I tell my muscle to contract, I don't want it to stay contracted unless I'm still telling it to contract. I need to end the signal. We have two ways to end the signal, right? So reuptake, we suck the neurotransmitter back into the axon terminal, or chew it up with an enzyme, enzymatic degradation. Chop up that neurotransmitter into little bits, right? So then it's done sending its signal. We then talked about the central nervous system itself and some overall features, right? So when we look at the central nervous system, we see areas that look whiter and areas that look grayer. The white parts, myelinated axons, just like nerves, right? So we have axons in the CNS as well. And the gray parts are the neuron cell bodies, as well as sometimes some axons that are so short, we don't need myelin anyway. Covered by membranes called meninges, and remember that's why meningitis, or infection of the covering of your brain and spinal cord, can be so dangerous. Protected by bones and CSF, right, the fluid that surrounds them. And then what we didn't talk about were types of neurons, because we ended then. So there are basically 3 different types of neurons that we're going to find in the central nervous system. And we're going to name them according to the direction in which they're sending their signals, okay? Because remember, an axon is an all or nothing when it sends a signal. It's also one way, okay? Each individual axon only sends a signal one way. So we have 3 basic types of neurons. If it's a neuron that is taking a sense, right, a sensory input to the central nervous system, so it's taking information this way, it is sensory or afferent, it's a sensory neuron. That kind of makes sense. If it's a neuron that lives entirely in the central nervous system and is just responsible for communicating with other neurons, it's an interneuron. Okay? So those are entirely in the CNS, and they just communicate with other neurons. And then finally, if it's a neuron that's going to send a signal out to the body, so from the central nervous system out to the body, motor or efferent output, we call those motor neurons. Okay? So 3 different types of neurons that we're going to find in the CNS. And this is just that information, so it shows up in the outline. Okay, so now the 2 different parts of the CNS, spinal cord and brain. We'll start with spinal cord. So it has all of these things that we just talked about, right? We have gray matter in the spinal cord. The gray matter is towards the middle, and the white matter is around the outside. It's covered by membranes called meninges. There's CSF floating around it. It's inside the vertebral column, like this, so it's protected by bones. And of course, we have those 3 types of neurons. We're going to come back to those in a little bit. So the spinal cord is where the nerves to all the parts of our body come in and out of. Because remember, nerves are just bundles of axons. There are no neuron cell bodies in nerves, none. No neuron cell bodies in nerves, right? So where are the cell bodies of the neurons whose axons are in the nerve? Most of the time, they're in the spinal cord, okay? So the nerves come in and out, right? These axons are coming in and out because they're cell bodies of those neurons are in the spinal cord. So almost all nerves in our body come in or out through the spinal cord. There are a few VIP ones that just come in and out directly from the brain, but most nerves go in and out through the spinal cord. And of course, some of them are taking information from the brain or the spinal cord out to the body, and that would be motor. And then some are bringing information from the body up, right? So that's going to be sensory. So We have information coming in two different directions, motor and sensory, using the spinal cord to get up and down from the brain. So what does the spinal cord do? Right? It's receiving these messages from the sensory neuron axons are coming in, bringing information in. We're sending messages out from motor neuron axons out into those nerves. And then we're also going to have some interneurons in the spinal cord that's doing some information processing for us. Okay? So this is all consistent, right? We've got sensory function happening, we've got motor function happening, we've got the interneurons at work as well. Now, there aren't a ton of interneurons in the spinal cord. The spinal cord is a pretty basic structure, pretty primitive. So for most things, we're going to send that information. We're going to kick it on up to the balls. We're going to kick it on up to the brain for more complicated, more sophisticated processing. But there is some processing that happens right at the level of the spinal cord. If I cut the spinal cord, right, make a slice of it, right? So imagine it's like a long sausage, and I make like a little pepperoni slice or something. Okay? Here's my gray matter, here's my white matter. What you'll see is that the cell bodies of the sensory neurons don't actually live in the spinal cord itself. They live in these little swellings out here called ganglia. Ganglia. So that's where they are, and they're receiving information along their axon and then relaying it in. Here's an interneuron, right? Gray matter, that's where the neuron cell bodies are. In this case, that interneuron is then signaling a motor neuron, which can send its signal out. So what I want to point out to you is that at every level of the spinal cord, in between the bones of our spine, we have sensory axons coming in, and we have motor axons going out. And they're all bundled together in a nerve. So at every single level of the spinal cord, we have nerves coming out, one on each side, that have both motor and sensory axons in them. And depending on where you are in the spinal cord, so the location in the spinal cord is specific to different parts of the body. So what I'm showing you here in this diagram, so here's the spine, and those are the little bumpy parts on the back. And in the middle is the spinal cord here. Right? And you see all these nerves coming out and going in, right? So motor and sensory. So the cervical spine, which is the spine up in your neck, the nerves that are coming out from the spinal cord up there are going to supply these parts of your body. Okay, so C2, which is way up, just this part of your neck in terms of sensory and motor. So in terms of my ability to feel this and my ability to do this, okay? It's coming in and out through cell bodies that are located in my spinal cord up here. My thoracic spine, that's this middle part here, right? So my belly button is getting its nerve supply from nerves that come out from the spinal cord right here. Okay? They come right out. My big toe, way down here. Okay, so at different levels of the spinal cord, you get different sensory and motor neurons located in those different regions. So that's really important if you have an injury. Okay? So here, this is high up in the neck. You see an injury here. Now, if my motor neuron that makes my arm move, part of my arm move, actually my part that makes my pinky move, comes out right here. But if there's a blockage or an injury here, the signal from my brain to tell my pinky to move can't get through. So my pinky will be paralyzed. And in fact, every motor neuron from here on down cannot get a signal from the brain to move. So therefore, I am paralyzed from that level down. Similarly, sensory information that's coming in from my belly button down here in T10 and trying to get up to my brain can't get through. Right? So you will have numbness and paralysis for all the parts of the body that are supplied from neurons at that level of the spinal cord and below. Yeah?
Can you have one without the other?
Can you have one without the other? Not if it's through the entire spinal cord. Okay? Sometimes if it's just part of the spinal cord in that region that's affected, then you might not have both symptoms. Or you might have one side of your body and not the other side of your body.
So what exactly happens when you have a stroke?
Oh, stroke is different. We'll get to that. Right? So this is spinal cord injury. So depending on the level, sensory information coming in from below there can't get up to the brain, and motor information that's trying to travel to areas below there can't get through. Right? So numbness and paralysis. So the location of the injury, therefore, determines the symptoms. If somebody has a spinal cord injury down here, they will end up as a paraplegic, but still have total use of their upper extremities, of their arms. Right? But if you have, right, so one of my colleagues in medical school actually had a lesion right here. So he was in a wheelchair and he could use some of the muscles in his arms, but not all of them. Right? Because there's different levels here. So it depends. So spinal cord injuries are not hugely common, but they're common enough, right, that most of us have known someone with one at some point in time. Vast majority are due to motor vehicle accidents, right? And then number 2 causes falls. My friend in medical school, it was a diving accident. Right? He's diving into a lake or pond somewhere. Right? So all those signs that say no diving, this is why. All right. So Christopher Reeve, does anybody here know who he is? A few of you. So he was Superman in the original 1980 movie or whatever. And he fell off of a horse and had a really high injury. So C2, so way, way up in the spinal cord. So complete paralysis and numbness from there down, including his diaphragm. So I don't know if you can tell in this picture here, this is a ventilator tube, right? Goes into his trachea. So he has to have a machine breathe for him because his diaphragm was paralyzed. Now, one of the interesting things about Christopher Reeve, he has since passed away, right? But one of the interesting things was he was able to get some function back, demonstrating what is called plasticity of the nervous system, meaning it does seem to have some ability to adapt and recover. There's a lot of research going on in that area right now, obviously, right, to see how we can encourage that to happen, to help people potentially heal or regain some function after some of these really significant injuries. One of the adverse effects in one of the vaccine trials actually is an infection of part of the spinal cord called transverse myelitis. It's a bad thing. So, all right. We're going to shift gear and talk about another feature of the spinal cord, spinal reflexes. So I mentioned before that most of the time, the spinal cord is going to send information up to the boss, send information up to the brain for more complicated processing, right? But sometimes the spinal cord is like, I don't even need to bother the boss about this. I can take care of this on my own, right? I'll let the boss know, but I'm going to go ahead and act and take care of it in the meantime. And so that's what spinal reflexes are for. Right? So if there are times when we need to respond really quickly to avoid potential injury, we're going to use a reflex. Here is the sequence of events in a spinal reflex. We're going to talk through them one by one. First, you have some type of a stimulus, right? So somebody pokes you with a pin, for example, or you put your hand down on a stove without realizing that it's hot, right? Or the doctor knocks on your knee with a little hammer. So fun, okay? So you have some sort of stimulus. That will be perceived by the axon of your sensory neuron. So step 1 is your sensory neuron sends a signal into the spinal cord. So that's step 1, right? The sensory neuron goes, hey, right? We're sensing something. Step 2 is that signal goes to the interneuron who lives only within the spinal cord. And the interneuron is basically making that decision and saying, I'm going to act on this right away. I'm not going to tell the boss yet. I'll let him know about it later. And so the interneuron then passes a signal to the motor neuron, which is also sitting here in the spinal cord. So step 3 is the motor neuron sends a signal out, usually to a muscle, resulting in movement. So jerking your hand away, your leg kicks out, whatever the reflex may be. Okay, so basically 3 steps. You've got the sensory neuron taking the information into the spinal cord, the interneuron receives it and passes it on to the motor neuron, and then the motor neuron sends the signal out to a muscle to contract. Right? This is a smart way to handle things that could potentially cause injury. It's really fast, okay? It's really fast. Right? That's good. It's kind of jerky though, right? It's super fast, it's automatic. You don't have to say, I think this is a little hot. I might get burned. I should take my hand away, right? It's automatic. Happens without conscious thought. Really fast, but it's jerky and it's not smooth and it's involuntary, right? It's not the most graceful thing, but it's effective. So that's a spinal reflex. Again, step 1, sensory neuron. Step 2, interneuron. Step 3, motor neuron out to the muscle. So most of the time we don't live our lives just via spinal reflexes, right? That would be more like earthworms. Okay. So for most things, we're going to send information up to the brain and integrate it, right? So we're going to have information coming up through the spinal cord to the brain, and then the brain is going to be sending information out through the spinal cord down and out to the body. So sensory, motor. Okay. Sensory, motor. But then how does the brain work? And what is going on there? Right, so now we're going to talk about the brain. The brain is pretty awesome. It orchestrates almost all of our body functions, everything except for spinal reflexes, basically. It's also the seat of conscious thought, right, and kind of our sense of ourselves. So it's fascinating, and so much of it is still not well understood. Okay. So the ancient Egyptians, who actually were pretty advanced in many ways, they actually believed that the brain's main function was to produce mucus. That was it. Because when they, embalmed people or, got mummified people, they would stick instruments in and mush up the brain so they could suck it out so that it wouldn't rot, And they're like, what's this gray, mushy stuff? It's up in the top of your head, mucus comes out your nose. It must make mucus. Well, we've come a long way from there, right? But initially they were like, it took actually a really long time, like hundreds and hundreds of years of scientific investigation, experimentation, to realize that your emotions were not actually coming from your heart or your stomach, your gut, right? It actually took us a long time to figure that out. And so eventually we figured out it was coming from the brain, but then we were like, is it like the brain as a whole? Or do different parts of the brain do different things, right? So this question of how is the brain organized? Or is it organized at all, right? Is it just some weird thing? So we're going to watch a video of one of my favorite people. She has gone on to do a lot of advocacy work for people who have speech difficulties. The word that's used to refer to speech difficulties from damage to the brain like this is called aphasia. And so she's done a lot of advocacy work now. But she's still, and she's had some improvement, but she still has some significant difficulty with producing speech and also with writing. All right, so moving on from the frontal lobe to the parietal lobe. So the parietal lobe is actually where we have, for the most part, sensory information. So all the sensory information from my skin and my skeletal muscles is going to go to my parietal lobe, which is back behind the frontal lobe, one on each side. So I have sensory neurons that are receiving the raw data, and then I have other neurons in my association area that make sense of it. Right? So remember how we talked about, at a Halloween party when they're like, oh, put your hand in the bowl of eyeballs, right? Or you go to the nature center and they're like, put your hand in and see if you can figure out what this is, right? So integrating that sensory information to make sense of it, that also happens in the parietal lobe. So that's the association area that analyzes that information. The taste area is also located in the parietal lobe here. This is your parietal lobe here. Broca's area is here, right? So Sarah's stroke was here. So parietal lobe is mostly for processing of sensory information from the skin and the skeletal muscles. Right? We have other senses that we'll talk about next week. They go to different places. All right, talking about other senses, the occipital lobe here on the back, that's for vision. We are very visually focused animals. So we have a big chunk of brain designated to receiving and decoding visual information. So the occipital lobe, which is way in the back of the brain, it's like our eyeballs are up here. Like, why couldn't it just be the part of our brain that's right behind our eyeballs? I don't know. Those axons have to travel all the way to the back of the brain, to the occipital lobe. All right. Temporal lobe. So this is on either side, right here, near your temples. And like you might think, this is where our centers for hearing are located. And on the left side, we have another area that has to do with speech and language. And that's called Wernicke's area. So the production of speech, right, motor speech was Broca's area in the frontal lobe. In the temporal lobe, on the left side, we find Wernicke's area. And this is what allows us to understand language. So I'm going to show you a video of this gentleman who has a lesion to Wernicke's area. And I am recording. Okay, so we've actually learned a lot about how we learn things, right? So how the brain retains information and builds upon previously acquired information. And so there's a few insights that might be a little bit helpful to you in your study. So it's worth sharing. So first of all, we're constantly receiving sensory input. Right now, the bottoms of my feet are receiving sensory input of the pressure of my shoes against them, right? My arm is receiving sensory information from the sleeve of my shirt against it, right? I'm receiving sensory information from the stuff on my face and neck, right? We're constantly receiving all kinds of sensory information. I can hear the ventilation system. I can see all of you. But at any given time, in order to be effective, we need to screen out the extraneous information. And so we have a part of our brain that's kind of the gatekeeper in deciding what information we pay attention to. And that's the thalamus. thalamus is located right here in the center of the brain. That's the part of our brain that filters out the extraneous information so that we can focus, right? So that we don't pay attention to things that aren't important in the moment, right? So were you ever like really engrossed in reading a book or watching a television show or studying or doing something, right? And your roommate like calls out to you or walks through the room or something, and you don't even notice, okay? That's your thalamus at work. So the thalamus decides what we pay attention to, right? And a lot of people who have ADHD, their thalamus does not seem to be working quite as assiduously, right? So they're constantly distracted because a lot of sensory information is getting through that normally would have been filtered out. That's why ADHD medicines help. They increase the function of the thalamus. So thalamus helps us decide what we pay attention to. It's like a triage center for what's important. And then the hippocampus is going to decide what we need to remember. Do I need to remember that Paula is wearing a green shirt today? No. Right? So I see that. That's information I received. I'm not going to keep that. Well, actually, now I might because I said it out loud. Okay, we'll get to that in a second, right? So our hippocampus is going to receive information, put it in short-term memory, and if we think it's, it's going to bounce it around the brain, and if we think it's worth holding on to, then we'll code it into longer-term memory, right? And so one of the things about the hippocampus is it can't do many things at once, right? So we need to be focused. And the other thing about choosing to remember something is if we engage more parts of our brain in it, we are more likely to remember it. Also, if we encounter it more frequently, we are more likely to remember it. You all know that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell because you have heard it again and again and again. You all know that if you like it, then you better put a ring on it, right? Not only because you heard it a lot, because it's also set to music, and there's dance that goes with it. So you're involving more parts of your brain. So the fact that I said that Paula is wearing a green shirt, and now I've repeated it, makes it even more likely that I'm going to remember it, because I'm using more parts of my brain around that piece of information. Also, we're not good at multitasking. So this is really interesting, and a lot of people in your age group kind of feel themselves to be masters of multitasking. And they've actually studied this, and what they find is if you are trying to do multiple things at the same time, it makes you feel very productive. So your own subjective sense of how productive you're being is that you're being really productive. But when they actually measure what people are able to do, what they find is that you're not actually paying attention to more than one thing at a time. What you're doing is called toggling. It's like switching back and forth between different windows or different tabs on your browser. You're focusing on one thing, and then you're switching and focusing on another thing. And then you switch back. And every time you switch, it takes you a while to be like, wait, where was I? Every single time. So in the end, you end up being much less effective because you're wasting time reorienting yourself every single time you toggle back and forth. So the research on learning is actually pretty conclusive that multitasking doesn't work because it is a fiction that we are actually doing two things at once. We actually toggle back and forth. Okay? So you lose time. All right. So this is reinforcing that idea, reinforcing, repetition, saying it again, right? That our senses evolved to work together. Vision influences hearing, right? So we learn best if we stimulate several senses at once. That is why coming to class and seeing me talk and gesture and point things out on the slide and seeing the things on the slide all at the same time is more effective and more efficient, actually, for learning than just watching the recording later or reading through the PowerPoint later. And so we've known this for a long time. They did studies and they would, give somebody some information, and then 2 weeks later, see how much of that information they had retained. How much could they remember? And what we find is that after 2 weeks, most people only remember 10% of what they read. You're like, oh yeah, that sounds about right. Okay? 20% of what you hear, and 30% of what you see. If you see and hear it together, like when you come to a lecture, or even better, if somebody does an actual demonstration, 50%. And then if you say it, like Paula's wearing a green shirt, I'm never going to forget it now, right? You remember 70% of what you say that's content related, right? You may not remember if you ask somebody if they were having a nice day, but if you're speaking about content, you remember it. And 90% of it, you say it and do it, right? So actually acting something out, like you will not forget, right? That there's a part of your brain important for muscle memory, and that's what you're doing, that's what you're building when you practice something. Okay? So you can hack your own brain and try to take advantage of this to help your learning and your studying, right? This is where writing stuff out, repetition, saying it out loud can be really helpful especially when you're trying to memorize. So the last thing I'm going to talk about today is sleep, because it's super important. What is it? It's a state of suppressed consciousness, right? You're not fully conscious. Your body's actually still quite active, just your muscles aren't. And you dream during part of it. We go through different stages. So deep sleep and then lighter sleep. And during these parts of lighter sleep, those are called REM sleep, or rapid eye movement sleep. That's when dreams happen. What are dreams? Good question. Right? One of the theories is that it's our brain's attempt to make sense of random sensory information that's just like popping up in our brain for no good reason. What's happening? During REM sleep, several important things happen. Most importantly, memory consolidation. Both motor memory and learned information, or declarative memory, fact memory, gets consolidated while you are in REM sleep. Those last 2 hours of the night, I think I have it here, yep. As the night goes on, your REM cycles get longer and longer. In fact, in the last 2 hours of sleep, you get about 50% of your total REM sleep, which is when memory consolidation is happening. So they did an experiment with the students, and they randomized half of them to sleep 8 hours a night, and half of them to sleep only 6 hours a night. And then they gave them memory tasks to do. So they had to do this for 2 weeks. And the students who slept only 6 hours a night for 2 weeks, who had missed out on about half of their REM sleep every night, performed as poorly on the test as if they had a 0.08 blood alcohol level. Okay? So you may feel okay on 6 hours of sleep, but your brain is not learning at peak efficiency. Your brain cognitively is kind of buzzed, actually. Yeah.
So when you sleep, why is it so hard to remember dreams if you're also memorizing things at the same time?
Well, for some reason, we're not memorizing our dreams. I don't know. We're out of time, so I'll stop there. Enjoy the nice weather. Have a good weekend. Take good care of yourselves. I will see you next Tuesday. Don't forget the quiz. It'll get posted later today. And from 3 to 4, I'll be in Blackboard Collaborate in our course room if you want to come in and talk about stuff or ask questions, right? So that's our office hours time. Thanks.